that any better now or worse, perhaps?
That's no, it sounds better. Yes, it sounds better. Thank you, Vincent.
Okay, great, no problem. So we'll go ahead with that then. Thank you, guys. So cognitive science is overall our attempt to understand the mind and to understand the brain. One question that comes up, of course, is what's the difference between the mind and the brain? One thing that we like to say these days, or that people like to put forward, is that perhaps the mind is a computer, or perhaps the brain is a computer, and the mind is just a program that's running on the computer. And it's kind of not surprising that this is a big question that everyone is asking, because as we go through history, whenever humans invent a new technology, we're very surprised by the new technology, we're very enthusiastic about it, and we immediately think that this might be how the brain works. This has happened over and over again, first of all with steam power, then with hydraulics, then with electricity, and finally, of course, with computation. And there are lots of other big questions that cognitive science tries to ask. We will try to answer during the course. How does my brain work, importantly? Why does it work the way it is? How does it do all these amazing things that have kept us alive through evolutionary time for the past few million years, and that keep us alive in our daily lives today? Why does my brain go wrong? Why do I make mistakes? Why do I miss things? Why do we make bad decisions? Is it possible for us to make better decisions? Are we kind of doing badly? Or is it the case that we're actually quite well optimized? Is it just that we evolved for a slightly different world than the one we live in at the moment? And where does my brain come from? How does evolutionary time, how do the things that we went through over the last few million years as a species explain how our brains are now? And what problems does that cause us in modern society? If perhaps we live in cities, in big groups of people, but we might still have these reflexes and ways of interacting that are more designed for living in tribes out in the savannah. How are other people's minds different? What is the individual variation between people, and how can we explain this? Why are there differences in things like people's memory capacity, people's ability to play chess, people's ability to learn languages, people's ability to solve decision problems, and so on? Is it a trade-off? If we have fewer skills or less good skills in one area, does that mean we've got more resources left over to have better skills in a different area? Or if we have good skills in one area, does that mean that we've got a better brain, and so we'll be better in other areas as well? So we don't really care that much about other people's brains, but humans care lots about other people's minds. We are very cultural, social creatures. We like to figure out how other people are feeling and what other people's point of view is. And part of that is related to consciousness. When we imagine what it's like to be someone else, we're kind of running a simulation of their consciousness. And we often assume that their consciousness is like our own. And this is one of the ways that people often come to cognitive science for the first time, by thinking about other people's consciousness. For me, I was introduced to the idea of subjective color. So the idea that maybe for everyone else, they see the color green and they don't have the same experience of green that I do. Maybe to everyone else, what I see as green looks red, and what I see as red looks green. How could you ever know? We would, of course, agree that we're looking at the same color, but we'd be feeling completely different things. So how does conscious awareness work? Is that anything special? What are all these mysteries to do with quantum computation, and whether this could be important for cognition? You may have heard in recent weeks, there's been in the news some announcements about quantum consciousness, Roger Penrose, for example, and there have been some suggestions that maybe the brain is some sort of quantum system. So we'll get a lot into that. We'll be able to answer that quite well, I think. And that's not good news for Penrose in that case, because the other option or the other way of seeing consciousness is that it's just what it feels like to have all the different parts of a brain working together. It's just what it feels like to have all these neurons firing and going around. And we'll talk in great detail about what neurons are and how they work, and whether they're actually the building blocks of the brain or whether they're just something that's not very important, like transistors in a computer. If you understand how a transistor works, then great, but that doesn't really bring you much closer to understanding how a computer works as a whole. And just like we're asking, is the mind a computer? We can also ask, are computers minds? Do they have the opportunity or the possibility to be conscious? This is very important in recent years. Since this course started, actually, this is the 4th iteration of this course that we're doing. ChatGPT and large language models have become very prevalent, and they've started to kind of sound plausible and sound good at things. But users of large language models often get a bit annoyed that they seem to have emotions. They seem to be sorry when they get things wrong, or they seem to be giving us compliments. They say, oh, that's a great idea. I'm happy to work on that with you. And they don't really have conscious feelings, or do they? Is it possible for computers to have that? And we'll argue, of course, it's not for large language models, because they don't really try and simulate the processes that a mind has. They just try and churn out the next word or the next token. But maybe other forms of computers which are actually trying to model the mind could be more conscious. So maybe cognitive architectures, which are simulations that actually try to work like the mind does in terms of how we remember and forget things. Forgetting's very important, by the way. Computers find it very hard to forget things. We find it very useful to forget things. There are some patients who literally don't forget anything. We will talk about this more when it comes to memory. And they find it very troublesome because they can't get rid of these bad experiences. So we like to think about other minds and to imagine other people's mental states, but can we actually decode them? Can we do essentially a lie detector? Can we read out what other people are thinking about? We'll discuss this, and it turns out you can to a great degree, and these are some of the most impressive results for me from cognitive science over the last few years. We're able to read out, still in quite a primitive way, what people are thinking about or what people are seeing in front of them. So we'll see a video that was obtained from someone's brain via MRI scanning, and we'll see that it looks reasonably like an approximation of what that person is seeing in front of them. So we're able to sort of decode what's going on in other people's minds, and we're getting better at that all the time. We'll look at some impressive examples of that, like trying to decode what people are dreaming. This is stuff that on one level is or seems absolutely mad, but it's stuff that we're able now to start thinking about doing. One of the other most impressive results for me is proving that people in comas, so people who are unconscious in the hospital, are actually thinking about stuff, and they're responding to, for example, their loved ones talking to them. So you can, with brain scanning, see activity in their brain. You can ask them sometimes yes/no questions, and you can see that they're replying to the questions, even if they can't talk or move any muscles. So we're able to increasingly see into other people's minds using technology and brain scanning. And if we get better at this, it could be that we can upload our mind into a computer, into a simulation, which is another big idea that's become very popular over the last few years. It's everywhere in modern culture, the idea that we might be in a simulation. It's even in pop music. And that's still very far away. So we'll talk about some of the reasons why it might still be very far away. That principally restrictions of scale. There's far too much going on in the brain that we could hope to simulate it. But maybe we can take some shortcuts and simulate at least some things. And we'll talk about chaos theory and complex systems. We'll see that even if you have a system that does have rules and that should be easy to simulate, then you can still have an unpredictable future. Even the three-body problem Some of you may have read the Three-Body Problem, the science fiction novel, and that shows as long as you have a simple system, you can still have chaos and you can still have unpredictability. This is a picture of the brain. Hang on, I'll just adjust this slightly. So this is one of the most famous cross-sections of the brain. We'll be very familiar with this by the end of the course. This is a cross-section down the middle, so right down the middle of the head. And you can see that the two halves of the brain aren't actually connected all of the way. They're connected in the middle here through the corpus callosum, which therefore has been cut because it's a slice down the middle. And these structures down here, the cerebellum, which is responsible for movement, and the brainstem have also been cut. But this area up here, the cerebral cortex, most of the brain hasn't been cut. This is just the left side. So we're seeing the right wall of the left side. The cerebellum's at the back. You can always notice the cerebellum at the back. The brainstem is kind of slanting forwards. And down here, there's room for the eyes. So this is the front. We'll get a lot more into neuroanatomy or brain anatomy as we go along. We'll get used to what all these structures do. And we'll get used to the idea that we can't always say that structures do particular things. It's not the same as a machine that's been designed by a person, for example, a refrigerator or a car. If you look at the engine of a car, you can take it apart, you can go, this is the spark plug, I know what that's for, and we're happy with that because another human mind also designed the car engine and they designed the spark plug. But the brain wasn't designed by anything. One of my favorite neuroanatomy lecturers, he always says, the brain just is. So it might not be possible to understand the brain in the same way that we can understand a machine or a computer or something that we've built. Cognitive science unifies several different fields, the important ones being psychology and AI and computing, because cognitive science is really psychology with the power of computing and the power of mathematics and modeling, and also some knowledge about language. The classic experiment in psychology is perhaps a questionnaire or a reaction time experiment. So it's an experiment where the results are quite obvious. You can just look at maybe a bar graph and you can see the results of your standard psychology experiment. But in cognitive science, we often need to do some computer modeling or to use some programs, both to run the experiment and to analyze the results afterwards, especially if there's some brain imaging involved with EEG or MRI scanning, where we're recording lots of data from the brain. I'll talk shortly about my background and the kind of experiments that I do. There's also a big crossover with philosophy, with ideas like representation. Some of you may be coming to this from Matthias's philosophy courses in Mindshop. So welcome if so. I've been a colleague and friend of Matthias's for about 10 years now. We've worked on various projects together, and he's actually going to be moving to be a closer colleague of mine at some point. So in philosophy, we think about things like, how is our mental idea of something, in this case, a cat, connected to the cat that really exists in the world? What does it mean for something to really exist in the world? Can we actually really ever say that we perceive things directly? This is going back to the Greek philosophers' view that we're only seeing reflections on or shadows on the wall of a cave. What's the relationship between the sign, so that would be maybe a word, the signifier, the actual real thing, and the signified, the idea that exists inside our mind? So representation is a central question in cognitive science. How do these ideas that we have in the mind relate to things outside in the real world? And how are we actually going to describe things in the real world? On one level, physicists tell us that everything's made from atoms and molecules, and that's okay, we're happy to accept that. But what about the next level up? Things get a bit cognitive. How do we define objects? What separates an object from its background, what separates the molecules that are currently in a living thing from the molecules in the air. So there are all these artificial distinctions that we put on the world that physics can't actually answer. We haven't actually worked out which of the molecules that I'm perceiving at the moment are in, say, this computer mouse. We just see the mouse as an object, and we don't have to worry about all the complicated physical stuff going on inside the world around us. Cognitive science is also computational, so we will understand what computers are. We won't do any programming on the course, but we'll understand what computers are and the building blocks that make them up. And we'll talk about a bit about the history of computer science and machine learning. This is the AI winter from the 1980s, where there was a huge withdrawal of funding for what we call fuzzy or soft AI, the kind that we're using at the moment to build ChatGPT. In the 1970s and 80s, you can see this blue part here, there was a huge movement towards symbolic AI, which tries to work how the mind does. But there was a big failure, and we all switched to deep learning, which is why we're in the situation we are now with ChatGPT. And the first success of deep learning was machine translation. This was the idea that AI has to learn from data. So we have to give it lots and lots of data to learn from. So there's a kind of a synchrony between AI research and cognitive science research. Very often, cognitive science will come up with an idea and show that the brain works like this. And then about 20 or 30 years later, the technology will be there to integrate that idea into machine learning and to put it into graphics cards so we can play video games and so we can run our machine learning. So we'll talk about AI and machine learning and the difference between the two, and we'll get to grips with this question of how could the brain be built up of smaller units that do small computations. We'll talk a lot about levels of analysis. This is a central metaphor for cognitive science. There's always the high level, which is kind of the big ideas, leaving aside the detail. A classic example of the high level would be consciousness. That's the highest level really of cognition. There isn't really a high level above consciousness unless you're talking about maybe groups of people. Then we can go down from the high level to the lower levels. And as we go down to the lower levels, things get more detailed, and they get more local. Once we get down to the level of atoms and molecules, perhaps the lowest level, all of the atoms and molecules are just bouncing off each other, and there isn't any long-range communication. So how does the brain build and put into place this long-range communication? This is always a challenge for complex systems. If you think about Europe, for example, or the American continent, for example, and if you think about how long it took to get in place the road network and the telephone network and to make it efficient for us to travel over long distances, the brain has very similar problems because the brain is enormous. It has 100 billion neurons, so it's more complex than a city, it's more complex than a computer. We do have about 20 billion transistors in our biggest computer chips now, but one transistor is only connected to three things. It's just an electric component with three legs, whereas one neuron can be connected to up to 3,000 other neurons. So the brain is actually a vast landscape. And if you took 1 second of life in the brain, you could expand that second over a few hours or a few days, and you still wouldn't be able to keep up with all of these fast processes that are going on. So we'll give a few examples of this high and low level distinction, mainly in vision. In vision, we'll see how we build up low-level concepts like lines and edges into bigger concepts like shapes, and then into things like faces and objects. And you can see here some other examples of the levels in language. So in language, we can think about individual letters, then individual words, and then sentences and paragraphs, and so on. There are various philosophical positions that cognitive scientists can take, and we will talk about these as we go along. Some of the big ones are realism. This is the idea that things do really exist independently from the brain. And everyone's happy with the idea that atoms exist, but what about the high-level ideas? The idea of a boat, for example. You can imagine the ship of Theseus, this idea from philosophy. If we keep replacing parts on the ship, then is it actually the same ship after a few years? In the modern world, you can imagine the car of Theseus. If I keep replacing all of the parts on my old car and none of the original parts are left, then does that car really have an independent existence, or is it just the fact that I thought that it was my car for that whole time? And eliminative materialism. This is one of my favorite philosophical positions because it kind of says that most of the way that we see the world is just a kind of helpful fiction that's in place to help us get through life, which makes sense really, given that a lot of the way we see the world is millions of years old. We break things up into volition and action and so on, and we blame things for things. We attribute consciousness to things that don't have consciousness. When the computer goes wrong, it's tempting to say, oh, the computer's having a bad day. So some of these mental states that we have are perhaps not linked to things that really exist in the real world. Okay, so we'll talk for a bit now about my background, and we'll go through the 10 lectures on the course, and we'll say what we're going to talk about in each of the 10 weeks. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. And I will just encourage everyone, if you have any questions during the session, then please go ahead. I'm always saying this in the lectures as well. I'm always encouraging questions. So please put your hand up or pop your question in the chat if you have anything you'd like to ask. So my background is in vision science. I did my PhD in experimental psychology at University College London, and I looked into face perception. So I did a lot of experiments in the lab, asking people to come in and test out their face perception. A lot of these experiments were quite time consuming, and some of them actually took place in a dark room. We often do this for vision experiments so that we can control exactly the level of light that the participants see. I still do vision experiments these days, but I tend to use eye tracking, which doesn't need to take place in a dark room. So participants will come in and sit in front of the computer and do some kind of visual search task, and we'll see where their eyes are looking. We can record their eye movements. And then you can ask questions about attention. You can ask, for example, if I pop up a big red square on one side, how do we orient to that? How do we find it? And we can try to make links with evolutionary psychology. At the moment, for example, I'm looking at numerosity. This is the idea that we have some kind of special detector to perceive numbers of things. And you can guess what the evolutionary reason for that might be. If you're looking at some bushes with fruit, then it is of evolutionary advantage to be able to see the bush with the most fruit and to be able to go there first, so you can get the food more efficiently. I also do research into knowledge representation. So this is more like decision making. So rather than doing visual experiments, we're asking people questions with words, and we're seeing how long it takes to answer the questions and trying to build a model of how they make decisions and how they represent knowledge. I currently work in between two universities in London, Imperial College and City University of London. I do more teaching at Imperial and more research at City. And at the moment, I'm thinking about how to apply for grant money, which is something that researchers spend a lot of time doing, of course. We have to come up with these 5-year projects or 3-year projects, get some money to do them, and then try and find some colleagues to help us answer the questions. Two of my colleagues, for example, they're actually a husband and wife, and they've both got a large fellowship. So they've got 2 large fellowships between them, and they're the first husband and wife team to ever do that. So well done them. Over the 10 weeks of this course, which will start next week on 7th of August, so all the lectures will be at 6:30 p.m. Mexico City time. That is 1:30 in the morning here in the UK. I'm speaking to you from London, UK, but I'm usually awake at this time anyway. I'm generally awake quite late, so it's not an issue for me. Sometimes I have a 1 hour sleep before the lecture, but they're always at the same time, and they'll be 2 hours. When you sign up for the course, you'll also have access to the course WhatsApp group, so we can ask questions, and you'll also be able to talk to previous students from the previous versions of the course. We'll share reading and so on. I'm usually available on WhatsApp if anyone has any questions or if there's anything you want to share. So people usually share interesting links. If anything exciting happens in the world of cognitive science, usually we post about it in the WhatsApp group. We can have a bit of a discussion. Each week, there are some readings in PDF format. This is optional, of course. And the lectures are recorded. They'll be available on Google Drive. So don't worry if you can't make it to all of the lectures. We do have recordings available. Hi, Lizuli. Lectures are in English. I do accept questions in Spanish, but I will answer them in English. And if you have any questions in Spanish, you can talk to Miriam on WhatsApp, and there's her number there. Mindshop is a project that's been going on for a few years. This is Matthias's idea, of course. He started these philosophy courses a few years ago. And the mission overall is to just get everyone talking and get everyone interested in the same ideas into a room together, so we can find out what's going on in from the professional viewpoint in philosophy or in psychology or in cognitive science. So we're bringing together people from across the world, many different professions and ages, and this will be the first Mindshop cognitive science rather. So we've done 3 versions of the course already, and these have been the first Mindshop courses we've done in English. When you become a Mindshop member, you get access to lots of other stuff as well. So there are various debate and movie clubs run by Matthias. There are various WhatsApp groups, and you can get discounts on other Mindshop things, other Mindshop projects over the years. We've worked on a couple of workshops together in London. So we ran an in-person psychology conference in London, which was quite fun. And we'll be doing more things in Mexico and Europe as we go along. When you sign up for the course, you'll get a welcome letter, general guidelines, a course syllabus with all the topics, links for the lectures and tutorials, access to the Google Drive, the WhatsApp group, and lifetime Mindshop membership. And there are a few different options for how to pay for the course. You can use the early bird price. There's a further discount if you're a Mindshop member, or you can do 2 payments later on, and you also get a certificate like this at the end. So what topics will we be covering? So we'll go now over the 10 lectures that we'll be looking at. For most of the course, we'll be flipping backwards and forwards between looking at the brain and talking about other stuff. So in week 3, week 5, and week 7, we're really focusing on what we know about the brain. But the questions that cognitive scientists are asking are constantly getting more complex. So we need to look at some other areas in order to get a good run-up at these questions. We'll start with, after doing an introduction in lecture 1, we'll start with mathematics and language. And we'll contrast cognitive science with psychology. Psychology is the idea that we can kind of look at behavior and work out what's going on in the mind without really looking inside the mind. This is Freud. He's the inventor of some classic psychological theories about the unconscious mind, but he didn't have brain scanning. He didn't have EEG or brain scanning available to him at the time. So it was impossible for people to look inside the brain at the time. They did a reasonably good job for the time, but now we are actually able to build complex systems. We're able to try and copy what the brain does, and that's a really good way of checking if we understand something. If you can make a good model of something and the model works, then you've got really good evidence that you actually understand something. And we can do this with, for example, face perception or motion perception. We can build algorithms that make the same mistakes that humans do, and they have the same performance that humans do. And we can check them against human data. And this is all stuff that Freud couldn't do, Jung couldn't do, and even up until the 1990s, when psychologists were still just using surveys and reaction time and so on. These are things that we couldn't do. One thing that makes cognitive science very different is that it's aware of other fields. To be a psychologist, you don't really have to do any maths at all because you can just use surveys, and you don't really have to know much about language. For the cognitive science perspective, we're really asking, we're going over to other fields like linguistics, and we're asking, what have you guys learned? Can we take that into cognitive science and try and use it to understand the brain? So in lecture 2, we'll talk about language. We'll go all the way back to the beginning of language, about 5,000 years ago for written language and further ago for spoken language. We'll look at how languages developed from a smaller number of original proto-languages and how they specialized and evolved. And we'll see that language is one of the things that makes humans human, because we use it for storytelling. Humans are all about making stories, either in our daily lives, in our careers, in our lifetimes, and also across geological times, so really far longer times than lifetimes. Here we're seeing some stories that are about 45,000 years old. So these are stories in Aboriginal Australia, and we can date them because they describe these particular floods and parts of land being cut off from other parts of land. And we know exactly when that happened geologically. So these stories have been passed down and preserved over something like 30,000 years. So they're central to human cognition. They're central to the way we understand the world. They're central to the reason that humans have such a long growing up period. We have such a long childhood and adolescence, because there are all these skills that we need to learn. We'll look at the field of linguistics more generally. We'll see that on the low level, we can look at the study of individual letters and sounds, phonetics, and then we can go up more high level, even to above language, things like pragmatics. If you say something, you might not actually just mean what you want to say. If you say, oh, it's very cold today, and you start shivering, you might mean that you want someone to give you a jumper. So what a sentence says isn't all the information that there is in a sentence. We can always bring into play our models of other people and work out what they're trying to say. We'll talk about how language is represented in the brain, things like parse trees in grammar. We can break up sentences into different parts, and can we actually track in the brain where these parts live? And we'll talk about mathematics. We'll introduce the idea of mathematics. It's quite similar to language in some ways and not in others. We won't actually do much maths in this course, but we'll see how maths can be used. Then in lecture 3, we'll get to the brain. So in lecture 3, we'll principally go back through history, and we'll look at wrong views of the brain, the mistakes that people made over the thousands of years that we've been studying the brain. We've said that whenever a new technology comes into play, people think, oh, we understand the brain now. And then, of course, it turns out that they were wrong. The Greeks were wrong about the brain. The Romans were as well. The Greeks thought that the brain didn't do anything to do with cognition. It was just there as a kind of cooling instrument. As we go through history, people started to get quite good at neuroanatomy. These are actually Leonardo da Vinci's drawings here. He got the detail of the skull perfectly, but if you look at the actual brain, he hasn't drawn any detail there because we didn't have microscopes or tools that we needed to understand it. The inside of the brain here is just these ventricles, which actually turned out to just be there for shock absorption. They're just kind of fluid-filled bags. So what Da Vinci thought was important about the brain wasn't actually that important. This is the Sistine Chapel. You may have seen this before, that the depiction of God here on the Sistine Chapel is actually a neuroanatomical cross-section of the brain. It's the same as this here. And this has been shown beyond any chance of coincidence. So there are all of these hidden messages in the Sistine Chapel that relate to neuroanatomy because Michelangelo was an anatomical artist as well. So we know that he had that information as well. We'll introduce large-scale brain anatomy. So we'll talk about the 4 lobes of the brain and the idea that the limbic lobe is a bit like the animal brain or the reptile brain. It's this area that evolved a bit earlier on and that is a lot older evolutionarily. And we'll introduce the idea of neurons. This is an electron micrograph showing how closely neurons are packed into the brain. So they're color-coded. You can see each one is a different color. A neuron is, of course, a cell that is the building block of thinking. We have 100 billion of them. They fire. We'll talk about what firing means for neurons. That's basically them sending information down the length of the neuron to the thousands of other neurons that might be listening. And we'll ask, is studying neurons actually important for understanding consciousness? Or do neurons not really matter? Is it like when you're making a website, you don't need to understand how the transistors or the battery of a computer works because they're more low level? On to computation in lecture 4, because computation is one of the foundations of cognitive science. We'd like to understand what it is. So we'll go back to the very first computers, their ways of manipulating symbols. This is a slide rule for doing multiplication and an abacus for doing addition. And on the bottom left, the Antikythera mechanism, which the Greeks used to predict eclipses. So computers go way back into history. We'll look at their history through the 20th century and we'll see what their building blocks are. Again, we won't actually do any programming on the course, but we'll see that using these basic building blocks like an OR gate, this has 2 inputs. It's a logical gate. The inputs can be either true or false, and the output will be true if at least one of the inputs is true. That's described by this truth table. The first 2 columns are the inputs. So you've got 4 different combinations of your inputs, and the output will be 1 or true or green, as long as at least one of the inputs is true. There are lots of other gates like this, and we put them together to make computers add numbers and then eventually to make them follow instructions. And then we've built this whole pyramid over the last 70 or 80 years, since about 1945, when computers started to really come into their own. We've built this whole pyramid of levels based on top of the electronics. So we've gone all the way up to object-oriented programming. This means that people can program computers without having to know all about the electronics. We haven't quite put natural language on the top of the pyramid yet. So we can't quite yet talk to our computers using English and get them to do things for us. I can't tell my computer to go and send an email. I can't tell my computer to go and book me into a hotel. So there is still a gap between the highest level of what computers can do and the highest level of what people can do. And that's probably a good thing, I think, because we'd have to deal with a lot more realistic AI otherwise. Over the last couple of years, people have been developing quite strong opinions on AI. So we'll explore those later on in the course. We'll explore things like how ChatGPT could affect education and learning. But for now, in lecture 4, we'll talk about computing, and we'll introduce quantum computing and how that's different, whether it could allow any different forms of consciousness or anything like that. With that in mind, in lecture 5, we will go back to the brain again, and we'll ask, could it be a computer? We'll look at some examples of the rather astonishing things that we have learned about the brain. We understand a lot about vision, for example. We understand a lot about face perception and motion perception. This is a map in the visual cortex. On the surface of the visual cortex at the back here of the brain, where all the visual processing happens. And we can see that the different directions of motion which you can perceive, so red is side to side, blue is up and down, and yellow and purple are at 45 degrees, are laid out in this weird tessellated fashion, which actually turns out to be the most efficient way to perceive the different directions. So we will zoom really far into the brain, in this case into the visual cortex, and look at what we find there and ask, could it be like a computer, or could it be like something else. The brain is also like a city. It's not modular. You can't take out a part of a city and run it on its own. The different parts of the city are all dependent on each other, and all the different systems in the city, like the electricity and the roads and the water pipes and so on, are all interlinked with each other. That's exactly how it is in the brain as well. So there's a great picture of all the blood vessels in the brain, and they're all woven in tightly with the neurons to supply them all with blood. So unlike in a computer where you can just unplug the graphics processing unit and plug it into another computer, and now the other computer has better graphics, we can't do that with the brain. It's not that modular. We'll start to introduce as well how we can look inside the brain. This is EEG, electroencephalography, which is very good at detecting time, but it's very bad at pointing out where things happen in the brain. It records these electrical signals from about 32 to 64 electrodes, which you can see on the head. I have done some work with EEG in the past. It is reasonably annoying because you have to make sure that all the electrodes are properly attached to the patient's head first. Each electrode has a little light on the computer, and you have to put this conductive gel and get them all to go green. And often when you move one, some of the other ones go red again and you have to start again. So it's a very time-consuming process, but you can get really good data once you've wired up the patient. MRI scanning is a lot easier. All you have to do is put the patient in the MRI scanner like this, and you have to make sure they don't have any metal with them, so that can be very dangerous. And then you can get images of their brain activity. So we'll talk about how we can get these images of activity. You're all happy, I'm sure, with getting an MRI of your arm. That's just an X-ray. That just shows, it's like an X-ray. That just shows you what the structure is. But using functional MRI, we can actually see which neurons are being active and therefore where thoughts are actually happening. And we're moving towards being able to decode them. But what we can do is figure out which brain areas are more involved in things like face perception. With this in mind, we'll go back to AI again. So from computing onto AI, and we'll look at early forms of AI from the 1960s, frames, Marvin Minsky's frames. We'll see how the technology has developed to be able to process images and video, and even moving 3D images. So that's 4 dimensions. If you've got the 3D image and then it's moving in time as well, you've got a 4-dimensional movie. And we'll look at these really advanced forms of AI that in the last 5 years have been able to do things like play Mario Kart. And in the last 10 years, they've been able to win at Go. In the last 20 years, they've been able to win at chess. So the list of things that people can still do is growing rapidly smaller, and AI is getting more and more competent. We'll talk extensively about large language models because a lot of people have a lot of questions about them at the moment. They're still a really new technology. So we'll see exactly how they work, and importantly, how the fine-tuning works. And we'll look at some experiments like this. This is 4 conversations with ChatGPT, but actually 2 of them are with ChatGPT and 2 of them are with a human. The participants in this experiment were asked to have a chat and then decide whether they thought they were talking to a human or they thought they were talking to ChatGPT. 2 of these are really a human, 2 of them are really ChatGPT, and we'll have a look further at this experiment. We'll talk about superintelligence and these science fiction things that AI might be able to do one day, or it might not. And we'll ask, do we actually want these things to happen anytime soon, or would we prefer to keep superintelligence for a few hundred years' time? Are we approaching the technological singularity yet? In lecture 7, back to the brain again. So we have all these AI techniques now. We're able to model individual neurons, and we understand them very well, actually. If you just have one neuron, then we more or less understand that. That's basically solved. It's when you start to have 10 neurons or 100 or even 100 billion working together that we start to have problems. One neuron is simply adding up these signals that are coming into it. Each signal is multiplied by a weight, so it can pay more attention to one signal if that's a very important one, and then it either fires or not. In lecture 2, we've already discussed what it means for a neuron to fire. It's basically doing a little sort of click like that, and then resetting and sending some information down the neuron. We'll talk about David Moore, a very influential vision scientist who introduced the idea that there are 3 levels. Again, we've got the low and high levels on which we can talk about cognition and computation. There's the low level, the implementation. If the process we're thinking about here is flight, obviously birds can do it, planes can do it, helicopters can do it as well, but they all use slightly different methods. That's the overall computation, flight, moving through the air. There are different medium level ways of doing it, different algorithms, and then different low level ways of doing it. You can imagine a robot that flaps as well, for example, but it doesn't use feathers, it just uses plastic. So Moore pointed out that we have to try and understand systems on different levels. And there are very interesting questions here. If you're studying flight, for example, and you've never seen a helicopter before, your definitions of flight will probably involve flapping and feathers. Then suddenly a helicopter comes along and you're asking, does it really fly or not? This is very similar to the question of, is a computer really conscious or not? What does that even mean now that we've got this new arena to think about? With these AI techniques in mind, we'll talk about modeling the brain, modeling systems like memory. We can show that there are lots of different types of memory and that they each have individual characteristics. And we can find out which structures in the brain, here the hippocampus, that's the blue thing here, it's the same as these structures here. The structures in the brain are usually duplicated. There's usually one on each side, so you've got actually 2 hippocampi there, and they're massively involved in memory. We'll see that the hippocampus is a bit like the conductor of the symphony orchestra that the brain is. There are lots of different brain areas which ideally should be all working together, and they should be helping us to live our lives. Sometimes some of them get a bit disconnected and go off on their own, and that can be a failure of the hippocampus or the conductor. We look at some exciting recent brain images. This is a simulation from the Blue Brain project, and you can kind of see the real complexity. This is part of a cat brain that's been simulated, and you can see the tiny fibers there that have been simulated. But even though we can simulate things like this, we're not really close to simulating even half the human brain yet. In lecture 8, this is one of my favorite ones. We'll look at perception. We'll start with visual illusions. There are some very shocking visual illusions, and they each show us a way in which we're evolved to fit our environment. In this one, the green spiral and the blue spiral are actually the same color. And I can prove that to you. We'll give 2 copies of this and bring them together, and we'll talk about why we have this illusion. Here's another one. In this case, you can switch your perception of the dancer between rotating clockwise and rotating anti-clockwise. So on the left and right, we've got some extra visual cues, so you can see which side's in front. And you can see the one on the left is quite clearly going clockwise. No, anti-clockwise, sorry. The video is a bit jerky. And the one on the right is going in the other direction. This is easier to see if the video is smooth. And the one in the middle, you can make it switch direction. If you think hard about it going anti-clockwise, and you can eventually make it switch. If you think hard about it going clockwise, you can make it switch back. The visual system, therefore, is very easy to study. There are lots of exciting illusions that we can show people in the lab, and this has enabled us to find out a lot about the visual system. Most of it happens at the back of the brain, above the cerebellum. There are all these different visual areas that process different things like color and motion. We'll see how they've been mapped out with MRI and electrophysiology. We'll see how color works. We've got 3 different detectors, and they give us this 3-dimensional color space. And we'll look at the perception of audio and music as well. This is another area that's actually remarkably well understood. Behind the temporal lobe here, if you unfold the temporal lobe, here it's being done with a metal spatula, then you can see the auditory cortex, and it's got this frequency map. So low frequencies are dealt with over here, higher frequencies are processed over here. So it's just like a piano keyboard. You've got the frequency map right there in the auditory cortex. And we understand very well how, for example, you can close your eyes and tell that something's coming from the left or right using timing. With all this in mind, in lecture 9, we'll look at what researchers are actually up to in the modern world. We spend a lot of time studying attention. Attention is what we use to find Wally. We know that Wally is a person with a red and white hat, and he's got a red and white horizontal striped jumper as well. So when we're looking for Wally, we kind of instruct our attention to look for these red stripes. That's why the artist has put lots of distracting red stripes in the picture. And Wally is actually here. The artist here is taking advantage of something called the attentional blink. As you're moving your eyes over the picture, you see these big red stripes here, and you think, oh, that's not Wally. And that makes you actually less likely to detect Wally here because you've had to move your attention away from these red stripes, which are not the target. Attention's closely related to consciousness. So we'll talk about the different theories of consciousness. If something doesn't make it to your consciousness, does it mean that you didn't perceive it, or did you somehow subconsciously perceive it anyway? And how do we show that? Can you flash an image at someone very quickly, for example, the classic unconscious message? Can you present something, as we say, sub-threshold, so that people say that they haven't seen it? If you show people, for example, an orange very quickly, and then you ask them to select a random fruit, then they're much more likely to select an orange, even though they say that they didn't see the orange. Something in their subconscious, something in the early visual system did see it. And we can use experiments such as the Posner paradigm. In this experiment, we have a target that's either going to appear on the left of the right or the right of the screen. The participant's job is to detect the target, and we can give them these cues, which are like clues, which say, hey, the target will probably be over here or it'll probably be over there. And we can vary how reliable the cues are. Some participants, we can give them cues that are always true, and some of them we can trick them and the cues might be wrong. And with this experiment, we can understand how our attention is switchable and how long it takes to take effect. Here you can see that if the cue comes very close for the trial, we don't have time to process it. We'll move up above attention as well and talk about knowledge representation and concepts. This is one of the most exciting areas in cognitive science at the moment, because we're starting to map out how metaphors work, how we can think and how we can understand complex ideas, and how we build together these concept networks. And in lecture 10, we'll talk about the future of cognitive science. Are we able to eventually think about things like mind uploading? What are the challenges there? How many hundreds more years of developing computing power would we need to go through before we can do that? We'll talk about Elon Musk's Neuralink and prosthetics that allow us to interface with the mind. And we'll talk about consciousness and about some very recent discoveries in navigation in place cells. This is one of the most exciting ways of showing how individual cells can build together into a bigger system. Here we have cells that fire, neurons that fire when the mouse is in a particular place. Okay, great. So that's more or less all I want to cover today. Usually we have about 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how many questions people have at the end of each lecture. But if anyone has any questions now, I'm happy to answer them. So we'll have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, feel free to put your hand up, or you can write your question in the chat as well. Yes, Santiago, go ahead. One second, sorry, I'm not sure I can hear you. Let me just check my audio.
Yes, I was muted, sorry.
Yes, I can hear you now, go ahead.
Excellent. It's a simple question, really. Why and when did the myth of the brain symmetry emerge? Because there's this idea that the left part is for the creative area and the right is for the analytical, but the brain has multiple areas. For example, the frontal lobe is well, in the left and the right, so it doesn't fit in that reductionistic model.
I have a book on this actually, so I looked into this
Oh,
a few years ago. I can share it with you at some point. These similarities or these patterns do exist, but they're generally very small adaptations. So it could be that one side is slightly better at language, or it shows slightly more activation. And to answer your question, this is usually from MRI studies. MRI studies are often counterproductive because they can tell you which parts of the brain have more activation. But that doesn't mean that these parts are doing all the work. And it doesn't mean that other parts aren't involved as well. So a lot of early MRI studies showed slightly more activity on the left-hand side when you're asking people to do tasks that involve language. And another thing that often happens in science is that journalists get hold of scientific results and they publish articles about it. Then people write popular science books, and everything gets a bit amplified and drawn out of control. So there is something there, but it's only a small difference. And some really interesting results here come from split brain patients who've had the two halves of their brain disconnected. So you can get the two halves to do two tasks at the same time, and the left side will often decide to do the tasks involving language. But it's not always that way, and some people might be the other way around.
so it's variable, basically.
It's definitely variable in intensity, yes.
Okay, well, thank you.
Great, good question. So I'll stay around as long as there are any questions. So feel free to pop your hand up if anyone else has one, or you can just write the question in the chat. Otherwise, we'll start the course next week. Yes, Santiago, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it's another question. It's basically, so about psychopathy. Psychopathy is strictly physical, or I mean, what's the deal with psychopathy? Because I understand that it's because of the prefrontal lobe that people are psychopaths. I mean, with psychopath, I mean the inability to feel empathy. So
yes,
what's their deal?
This is a big area of research, and two of my colleagues are actually looking into psychopathy at the moment. One of the big results on this is it's a funny story actually of the professor who worked on psychopathy. You may have heard this one, and he did an MRI which indicated that he himself had psychopathy. And when his friends and family heard about this, they said, "Oh, that explains quite a lot." He didn't have any of the negative presentations, of course. And then another important result is that the correlations of psychopathy with professions like CEO and surgeon. There are many what we call mental disorders which we don't understand yet, and psychopathy is one of them. One way we can start to define it is by just operationally saying what it looks like. This is the purview of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but we don't actually know what might underlie psychopathy. And importantly, we don't know yet whether it's an adaptation or whether it's an actual failure. And this is the case for lots of other so-called mental disorders as well. So things like ADHD, that might be an adaptation for foraging. Things like depression, that might be an adaptation for when there's no food and we need to really, really save energy and essentially hibernate. The modern view of what is a disorder and what is not a disorder is largely guided by American views from the last 50 years. We won't really talk too much about clinical psychology on this course, but it is a really important area. And we see effects like in China, there are mental disorders that don't occur anywhere else. And in South America, there are mental disorders that don't occur anywhere else. So a lot of it is cultural. We can definitely talk more about psychopathy and some of the things, and I have some references to share. Sinead, do you have a question?
Yes, and when you mentioned the studies about face perception, what do you mean? Is is maybe the reactions about the feelings?
So mainly about identity. So how do we store our memories of people that we know, and how do we recognize them? Experiments that I've done in this area, for example, we asked, is it possible for you to recognize your friends just by the way they move their faces? So we made some video recordings of, we got friends into the experiment, so two people who knew each other. We made video recordings, and then we transferred their facial movement onto a virtual avatar. So it was someone else's face, but doing their expressions. And we tested their friends to see if they could recognize who this was. And in some cases they could, in some cases they couldn't. One of the core conclusions there is that we represent faces in a sort of face space. So it's got lots of dimensions, and the first dimension is male to female. The second dimension is how aggressive the face is. And there are about 30 or 40 such dimensions. And with these 30 or 40 numbers, you can represent pretty well what most faces look like. So that's an example of a high dimensional space. If we're talking about images, an image has, say, 20,000 pixels in it. So that's a lot of information. That's 20,000 numbers. But using this idea of face space, we can compress a face down to just 20 or 30 numbers. And that's therefore a lot easier to store. So that's a high level space. That's one of the main ways that the brain uses to deal with all this information that that's constantly flooding in through the eyes. So yeah, mainly about identity and how we recognize all these different people.
Okay, so it's related maybe to the perception and the storage of the mindset.
Yeah, to visual perception and to memory. And some people, of course, have failures in face perception. This is called prosopagnosia, where you're not able to recognize people's faces. My colleague works on this, and he organized a conference once for prosopagnosic patients. So there were about 100 people. They all came to the conference, and none of them could recognize faces. And my colleague forgot to print the name badges. So that was very bad. That's one conference where you definitely want to print the name badges.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, so hands up, anyone else? Gabriel, go ahead.
Cool. Just one question. Does the brain ever stop developing? For example, in the case of the frontal lobe, I've read that it stopped developing at around 25. Is that accurate?
Brain cells, neurons do die at an accelerated rate after adolescence. So we're constantly losing brain mass. But one of the reasons we do this is to go towards more efficient solutions. In terms of people's competence in tasks, that generally gets better up until about 55. There are some more high-level tasks that you continue to get better at as you get older, principally involving knowledge, things like diplomacy, and tasks that involve your experience from having previous patients or working on similar problems in the past. So that the brain does definitely degenerate, but we don't want to say there's a particular time at which it peaks. It's different for different skills, things like reaction time and color perception, sensitivity to contrast and noise and so on. Younger people are generally better at them, and things that involve drawing together knowledge and experience, so decision making, generally gets better as you get older. But if you're just looking at the number of neurons or the amount of grams of brain mass, then that is constantly going down after adolescence, yes.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks. Feel free to follow up anyone if you have if you want to go into any more detail. So generally in the lectures, we have a good amount of time at the end. So we generally get into a bit of debate, and people are often sharing their experiences as well. Because cognitive science is trying to understand the mind, everyone's got relevant experiences from childhood. The first time you realized about how vision worked, for example, and I can share some of those as well. So the course will start about this time next week, so 6:30 p.m. 7th of August. All of the we've got 10 lectures. They're all 2 hours. They're all 6:30 p.m. There are some other optional elements of the course as well. You can write a 1,000-word essay near the end if you like on a topic of your choice, and I can give you feedback on that. But that's optional, of course. You wouldn't have to complete the essay. And you can even present the essay to others if you like, and do a little talk about it if you want to. So in the chat, I will post the website for the course. So I'm just putting that in there now. And on there, we've got all of the information about the lecture times, we've got the syllabus, and we've got the sign-up links as well. The early bird prices are available until 3rd August, midnight, last time zone in the world. And I'll share the recording with everyone as well, in case you want to go over this session again. Okay, so I'll give one more minute in case there are any final questions, and then I think we'll finish up. So just pop your hand up if you do have a question, or you can write it in the chat. Otherwise, thanks everyone for attending. If you're joining us on the course, I'll see you next Wednesday. So have a good week. Let me know if you have any questions in the meantime. And yes, good to see you all. Yes, Santiago, go ahead.
Yeah, I had just another question yet.
Go ahead.
It's about looking information about the mental illnesses that are exclusive in specific countries, like you said earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, where can I look up more information about that?
Right, I can send you some more information. I have some slides about this, but there's if you look up put that search term into Google, you'll find there's one in South America where people feel that they have a shortness of breath. I forget what it's called now, but it's only reported in South America. And another one to look at is in Asia, there's a completely different response to depression because there's a different approach to culture and to individuality. So it can be a different response to depression. Sometimes you don't have the same relationship with it. I will look up the slide that I have about this, and I'll share it with you. I'll put it in the course WhatsApp group, or I'll message you personally with it.
All right, thanks.
Okay, great, thanks. Right, so we'll finish up there now. Thanks for joining me today in the welcome session, and I'll see you next week in the course. Cheers, everyone. Good to meet you as well, and have a good rest of the week.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you. Have
Bye,
a good
guys.
Bye bye.
You too. Good to see you, Luzuli, as well. I'll catch up with you later.